The tractor was in her soybean field when the water went down. It had come with the flood, the June 2008 event that put 8 feet of water through the Vermilion River bottomland and deposited, among other things, a Massey Ferguson 5460 from her neighbor's operation into the northeast corner of Patricia Kern's 40-acre property outside Eugene, Indiana. The machine had been stored in a low shed near the river. The shed had not survived the flood. The tractor had floated or been pushed or been carried. Nobody was certain of the mechanics. Approximately 400 yards, and come to rest in Patricia's beans with its cab pointed toward the county road and its engine compartment full of river silt. The neighbor's name was Gary Hollis. He farmed 320 acres to Patricia's north and had sustained significant losses in the flood. The shed, the tractor, a grain auger, and roughly 14,000 bushels of corn he had been storing in a low bin that had not been designed for submersion. Gary was 56 years old and insured, and the insurance was going to cover most of the losses, but the coverage on the 5460 was actual cash value, which the adjuster placed at $11,400. The machine was 8 years old, with 6,200 hours on it. $11,400 was what the depreciation schedule said it was worth. What it would cost to restore it from its current condition was more than that. Gary told Patricia this when he came to look at the machine 2 weeks after the flood, standing in her bean field with his boots in the silt that had dried to a pale gray crust over everything the water had touched. He said, "Insurance isn't going to cover a restoration at this point. Machine's not worth what it would take to fix it." Patricia said, "What are you going to do with it?" Gary said, "Scrapper, probably, unless you want it." Patricia looked at the machine. It was 44 years old and had been farming since she was in her 20s and had grown up on her own family's ground 30 miles north before moving to Vermilion County with her husband in 1989 and taking over the 40 acres when he passed in 2004. She ran a small operation, soybeans and a market garden, and maintained her own equipment with the focused practicality of a woman who had been doing her own maintenance since 2004 because the alternative was paying someone else to do it, and the budget did not support that alternative. She said, "I'll take it." Gary said, "It's in rough shape. Flood damage, silt and everything. Electrical's probably gone." Patricia said, "I know what flood damage looks like." Gary said, "I'll sign the title over. It's yours if you want it." Patricia said she wanted it. Gary signed the title over on a Thursday afternoon in July of 2008. Patricia had the machine pulled to her equipment shed with a tractor and a chain and began, on the following Saturday morning, to assess what the flood had left her. Patricia Kern was 47 years old in 2008. She had been doing her own equipment maintenance for 4 years, since the spring after her husband David had died, and she had learned it the way she had learned everything practical in her adult life, by reading the manual, doing the work, making mistakes, and doing it again with the knowledge the mistakes produced. She had not grown up mechanically. Her father had been a veterinarian in Fountain County, and her mother had taught elementary school, and neither of them had prepared her for the specific education of maintaining aging agricultural equipment on a budget that did not permit mistakes. What they had prepared her for was the discipline of learning, the patience to read something carefully, and the honesty to acknowledge when she didn't understand it, and the persistence to find the answer before proceeding. She had applied that discipline to equipment maintenance beginning in the spring of 2005, when her primary tractor had developed a hydraulic problem that the dealer quoted at $1,800 to diagnose and repair. $1,800 was not money Patricia had available without consequence. She had bought the service manual instead, read the relevant sections, determined that the problem was a failed O-ring in the hydraulic pump, ordered the O-ring for $4.30, and replaced it herself on a Sunday afternoon. When the hydraulic system worked correctly the following Monday morning, she understood something about herself that she had not previously verified. She could do this. She had been doing it ever since. By 2008, she had rebuilt a transmission, replaced an injection pump, rewired a cab electrical system, and fabricated a loader bracket from steel she had cut and welded herself after watching 3 tutorial videos and practicing on scrap metal for 2 weekends. The fabrication was not pretty. It worked correctly and it held, and that was the standard she applied. The Massey Ferguson 5460 in her shed presented a different scale of challenge. Flood damage is not a single problem. It is a collection of problems. Silt in the engine, silt in the transmission, silt in the hydraulic system, water in the electrical connections, corrosion beginning wherever water had penetrated and been replaced by air. The problems were not individually impossible. They were collectively significant. Patricia made her list on the first Saturday. The list had 14 items. She worked through them in the order that the machine's systems dictated. Fuel system first, because nothing else mattered if the engine wouldn't run. She flushed the fuel tanks, replaced the fuel filters, cleaned the injectors, and attempted a start. The engine turned but did not fire. She moved to the injection pump, which she had rebuilt once before on a different machine. She rebuilt it again, using a kit she ordered from a supplier in Indianapolis. The engine fired on the following Saturday. It ran rough. She expected that. She let it run for 20 minutes and listened to what the roughness was telling her. 2 things. The turbocharger was damaged, a bearing noise, subtle but present, and one cylinder was not contributing fully to the power output, which suggested a compression problem on that cylinder. She added both to the list. The turbocharger she replaced with a rebuilt unit sourced from a supplier in Terre Haute for $480. The compression problem resolved itself after 3 heat cycles as the engine expanded and seated components that the silt intrusion had displaced. She had not expected that resolution and noted it in her repair log as compression issue, resolved without intervention after heat cycling, mechanism unclear, note for future reference. The note for future reference was characteristic. Patricia kept a repair log for every machine she worked on, recording not just what she had done, but what she had observed and what she had concluded and what she remained uncertain about. The log had been a practice she started in 2005 and had maintained since. By 2008, it was 4 notebooks, organized by machine and date, representing 3 years of accumulated mechanical knowledge that she had built from nothing. The 5460 got its own notebook. By November of 2008, 5 months after Gary Hollis had signed the title over in Patricia's soybean field, the Massey Ferguson 5460 was running. Not perfectly. There were systems she had addressed provisionally and intended to revisit, and the cab electrical was functional but not entirely clean. But running. It ran correctly enough to work, which was the standard that mattered. She used it through the fall on her own ground and found it adequate for what her 40 acres required. The engine produced power without hesitation. The hydraulics functioned correctly. The transmission shifted through all ranges without grinding. Whatever the flood had done to the machine, Patricia's 5 months of work had addressed enough of it that the machine was operational. In December, her neighbor to the south, a farmer named Walt Prescott, who farmed 200 acres and ran an aging Massey Ferguson 390 as his primary tractor, asked Patricia if she had heard about the 5460 she'd taken from Gary Hollis. Patricia said she had it in her shed. Walt said, "I heard you fixed it up." Patricia said, "It's running, yes." Walt said, "I've got a problem with my 390, hydraulic pump. The dealer wants $1,200 for the repair. I can't get them out here before February, and I need the tractor for feeding livestock through the winter." Patricia said, "What's wrong with the pump specifically?" Walt described the symptoms. Patricia said it sounded like the pump seal, possibly the gear set if the seal had been leaking long enough to run the pump low. She said she'd look at it if he brought it over. Walt brought it over on a Saturday. Patricia spent 2 hours diagnosing and determined the problem was the rear seal, the simpler of the 2 possibilities, with no damage to the gear set. She had the seal in her parts stock, left over from a previous repair. She replaced it on Sunday. Walt's tractor was running correctly on Monday. Walt asked what he owed her. Patricia said $40 for the seal. Walt said, "What about the labor?" Patricia said, "An hour and a half." Walt said, "What do you charge?" Patricia thought about it for a moment. She had not charged labor before. She said, $40 an hour. Walt said, "That's less than the dealer." Patricia said, "I'm not the dealer." Walt paid $80 and drove home. He told 3 farmers at the elevator the following week. All 3 of them called Patricia before January. The pattern that established itself in the winter of 2008 and 2009 followed the logic that all such patterns follow. A neighbor needed something, the something was available, the transaction was fair, and the neighbor told other neighbors. By the spring of 2009, Patricia had done repair work for 7 farms in Vermilion County. By the fall, 11. By the spring of 2010, 17. She was working evenings and weekends and had begun turning work away. Not because she lacked the skill, but because she lacked the hours. And the hours she had were needed for her own 40 acres during planting and harvest. She thought about this problem the way she thought about mechanical problems, by identifying what the constraint was and determining whether it could be addressed without compromising what was working. The constraint was time. The solution was help. The complication was that help cost money, and the repair business was not yet generating enough to cover the cost of help at rates that competent mechanics commanded. She solved it in a way that the situation suggested. In the spring of 2010, she hired a recent high school graduate named Tyler Marsh, who had grown up on a farm in Fountain County and had been working at a grain elevator since graduation because nothing else immediately available. Tyler had no formal mechanical training. He had grown up maintaining equipment with his father and had the practical knowledge that farm upbringings produce in people who pay attention. Patricia paid him $12 an hour and spent the first 3 months teaching him the standard she applied to repair work. The standard was simple. Understand the problem before addressing it. Address it correctly the first time. Document what you found and what you did. Tyler absorbed it with the specific receptiveness of someone who has been doing things intuitively and is now being given language for the intuition. By the fall of 2010, he was handling routine repairs without supervision and bringing Patricia the complex ones for consultation before proceeding. She hired a second mechanic in 2012, a third in 2014. The repair business crossed $100,000 in annual revenue in 2011. Patricia noted it in her farm journal with the same plainness she applied to yield records and maintenance logs. A fact, recorded because facts should be recorded. By 2015, the shed that Gary Hollis's tractor had floated into was no longer adequate. Patricia built an addition, 30 feet of concrete block, 2 additional bays, wiring for a second welding station, $38,000 paid from operating revenue without financing. What she had built in 7 years was not what she had planned to build in 2008. She had planned to strip a flooded tractor for usable parts. Instead, she had a repair business with 3 mechanics, a client base across 4 counties, and a shed that had been expanded once and would need expanding again before long. The business had not been designed. It had been built from what the situation required, one decision at a time, each decision made with the same standards she applied to everything. Understand the problem, address it correctly, document what you found. The Massey Ferguson 5460 was still in her operation. She had addressed the provisional repairs in 2010 and 2013, and by 2015 the machine was as sound as any flood-damaged tractor rebuilt from silt could be. It had crossed 9,000 hours. She maintained it by the log, by the schedule, by the standard that the first repair had established and every subsequent repair had maintained. Gary Hollis came to Patricia's shed in the spring of 2016. He had sold his operation in 2013. The combination of the 2012 drought and his own decision to retire had produced a sale to a younger farmer who was expanding in the county. Gary was 64 years old and had been living in town for 3 years. He came to Patricia's shed because he had been driving past on Route 17 and had seen the addition, the service trucks in the lot, the sign on the building that said Kern Agricultural Services in plain black letters on a white background. He stood in the lot and looked at the sign for a moment. Then he went to the shed door. Patricia was inside with Tyler, going over the diagnosis on a combine that had come in the previous day. Gary said, "I heard you built something here." Patricia said, "I did." Gary looked around the shed. The lifts, the parts shelving, the second welding station, the organized tool storage, the 4 machines in various stages of attention. He said, "Out of the tractor I gave you." Patricia said, "The tractor was the beginning. The rest came after." Gary said, "How much is it doing?" Patricia said, "Enough." Gary said, "I should have known you'd do something with it." Patricia looked at him. Then she said, "You said take it or call the scrapper." "I took it." Gary said, "I know. I'm glad you did." He looked at the 5460, which was parked in the corner of the shed in the space it had occupied since 2008. It was the oldest machine in Patricia's shed and the one with the most complicated history. The silt in the fuel system, the turbocharger bearing, the provisional repairs, the 8 years of service since. Gary looked at it for a long time. He said, "Does it still run?" Patricia said, "Every day I need it to." Gary said, "I put 4,200 hours on it before the flood." "You've put how many since?" Patricia said, "About 5,000. Gary nodded. He said, 9,200 hours total. Patricia said, "Give or take." Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I signed that title over because I figured it was junk. I figured maybe you could get a few parts off it." Patricia said, "It wasn't junk. It needed work." Gary said, "Most things do." He thanked her for her time and drove back to town. Patricia went back to the combine diagnosis. By 2020, Kern Agricultural Services had 6 employees and $340,000 in annual revenue. The business had grown in the way that things grow when they solve a real problem at a fair price, steadily, without advertising, through the specific word of mouth that flows in farming communities when something works correctly and the person doing it can be trusted. Patricia's 6 employees were all people she had trained. Tyler Marsh, the first, was now her shop manager. 12 years in the shop had made him the kind of mechanic that dealers spend years trying to develop and often fail to retain. The kind who can diagnose a problem from a description over the phone with sufficient accuracy that the parts are ordered before the machine arrives. The others had come at different points in the business's growth, each selected for the same quality: farm background, practical knowledge, the willingness to learn the standard and apply it consistently without cutting the corners that are always tempting to cut when the simpler solution is close at hand and the correct solution requires more time. Patricia had turned down 3 offers to buy the business since 2016. The first was from a dealer group that wanted to add an independent service operation to their county presence. The second was from a private equity firm that was assembling agricultural service businesses across the Midwest. The third was from a regional competitor who had identified Patricia's client base as a strategic acquisition. Each offer had been financially significant. Patricia had turned each one down with the same reasoning she applied to any decision. The business was doing what it was supposed to do, which was provide correct repair service to farming operations in her county at a fair price, and selling it to an entity whose interest was financial return rather than correct service would change what it was and what it did. She was not interested in changing what it was what she had built it to be. The 40 acres Patricia had been farming when Gary Hollis signed over the 5460 were still being farmed. She leased half of them to a neighbor and worked the other 20 herself with a smaller equipment set, doing the field work on evenings and weekends with the specific efficiency of someone who has been farming 40 acres alone for 20 years and has the schedule organized around the work without thinking about it. The Massey Ferguson 5460 was still in the shed. Patricia had rebuilt the engine in 2017, not because it had failed, but because the hour count and the compression tests and the oil analysis had told her collectively that the rebuild window was approaching, and that approaching it on her schedule was better than arriving at it under the pressure of a field failure. The rebuild had cost her $3,200 in parts and 2 weeks of her own time. After the rebuild, the engine ran as clean as it had run in 2001, when Gary Hollis had bought it new. In the spring of 2020, Gary Hollis brought his son-in-law's tractor to Kern Agricultural Services for a hydraulic repair. Gary had moved back to Vermilion County the previous fall to a smaller property, doing some hobby farming that the son-in-law helped with when his schedule allowed. The tractor was a different brand, not Massey Ferguson. Patricia's shop worked on all brands. Gary dropped it off on a Monday morning. Patricia was in the shop with Tyler when Gary walked in. She looked at the work order, looked at the tractor, and said they'd have a diagnosis by Wednesday. Gary said, "No rush. I appreciate you taking it." Patricia said, "That's what we do." Gary looked around the shop, 6 bays occupied, 4 mechanics visible, the parts shelving that covered 2 walls, the documentation system on the office computer that Patricia had built from her original paper notebooks. He said, 12 years from that tractor in your soybean field to this." Patricia said, 12 years and a lot of Saturdays. Gary said, "Was it worth it?" Patricia looked at him. Then she said, "Gary, you signed over a flooded tractor because you figured I might get a few parts off it. I got 12 years of work out of it and 6 employees and enough revenue to do it right. Was it worth it? Good, I suppose that answers it. Wednesday on the diagnosis. Tyler will call you." Gary nodded and left. Patricia went back to the combine she had been working on before he arrived. The Massey Ferguson 5460 was in the corner of the shop where it had been since 2008. 9,200 hours on the body, 3,000 on the rebuilt engine. The repair log that Patricia had started when the flood left it in her soybean field was in the filing cabinet in the office. 12 years of entries, the complete history of a machine that had arrived full of river silt and been made to run and had kept running because someone had decided it was worth making run. It was worth it. Patricia had known that in July of 2008 when Gary Hollis stood in her soybean field and said, "Take it or call the scrapper." She had not known it would become $340,000 in annual revenue and 6 employees and a sign on the building in plain black letters on a white background. She had known it was worth making run. The rest had followed from that. It always did. The auctioneer moved through the yard at a pace that suggested he had already mentally closed the sale before the bidding started. It was a dispersal auction, the kind that happens when a man dies without a succession plan and his estate needs to be liquidated in a single morning. The farm outside Liberal, Kansas, had belonged to Earl Tatum, who had run a wheat and grain sorghum operation on leased ground for 31 years before a stroke took him in February. Earl had no children. His nearest relative was a nephew in Wichita who had not been to the farm in 11 years and who had hired an auction company to clear the equipment because the alternative was managing it himself. The nephew had set no reserves. He wanted the property empty and the proceeds in a check by Friday. The Massey Ferguson 5711 was the last significant piece of equipment in the yard. It had not been the last piece by accident. The auction company's ringman had looked at it the previous day during the preview and made a quiet professional assessment. Flood damage to the cab, seized engine, destroyed electrical system from what appeared to be a combination of moisture intrusion and rodent activity in the wiring harness. The hydraulic system had not been tested because the engine wouldn't turn over. The ringman had positioned the machine at the end of the auction order because he knew what happened when a crowd that had already spent its money watched a damaged tractor go across. The number would be low. Better to get there when the serious buyers had already loaded and left. By the time the auctioneer reached the 5711, the yard had thinned. The 2 John Deere tractors had sold in the first hour at prices that reflected strong demand and a competitive crowd. The tillage equipment had moved steadily. The grain handling items had drawn good numbers from local elevator operators who had made the drive specifically for them. What remained in the yard when the auctioneer pointed at the Massey Ferguson was a smaller group, the buyers who stayed to the end, because the end was where the distressed equipment appeared, and distressed equipment was what they had come for. Walter Grubb had been at the back of that group since 9 o'clock. He was 66 years old. He had spent 40 years working in John Deere dealership service bays, the last 22 of them as a senior technician at a dealership in Meade County, Kansas, that had employed him until a corporate consolidation had eliminated his position 14 months earlier. The consolidation had been handled in the way that corporate consolidations of regional dealerships are typically handled, with paperwork, with HR language about workforce restructuring, and with a severance check that did not reflect 4 decades of accumulated mechanical knowledge walking out the door. Walter had taken the check, cleaned out his toolbox, and driven home to the property outside Liberal, where he had lived for 31 years, and where his wife had already begun asking him what he was going to do with himself. He had not answered that question directly. He had built a shop addition onto the existing detached garage, 12 by 24 feet, heated, with a proper lift he had located through a dealer equipment liquidation and purchased for less than a quarter of its replacement cost. He had arranged his tools, which were substantial, along the walls with the precision of a man who has organized tools his entire working life. He had a workbench, a parts washer, a hydraulic press, and a set of diagnostic equipment that covered the major agricultural equipment platforms he had worked on across 4 decades. He had a laptop with service manual subscriptions. And he had, as of the auction morning in March, no particular plan for what came through the shop door. He had come to the Tatum dispersal because dispersal auctions are where a man who knows machinery and has limited capital finds the intersection of low price and high potential. Walter had attended 11 equipment auctions in the 14 months since his layoff. He had bought 3 machines, a used sprayer he had repaired and sold, a loader tractor he had sold to a neighbor, and a hay rake he had fixed and used himself. He had made money on 2 of the 3 and broken even on the 3rd. He was not operating at scale. He was operating at the pace of a man who is figuring out what comes next by doing it, rather than by planning it. When the auctioneer reached the Massey Ferguson 5711, Walter moved forward from the back of the group. The auctioneer opened at 500. Nothing moved. He dropped to 400. One hand went up, Walter's. Nobody countered. The auctioneer looked around the yard with the practiced patience of a man who has sold equipment nobody wanted in front of crowds that had already left. He said 400 once, 400 twice. He said sold. Walter paid cash. He arranged transport through a neighbor with a flatbed. The machine was on his lot by 3 o'clock that afternoon. He did not start the inspection that day. He had learned across 40 years of dealership work that the worst time to assess a damaged machine is immediately after acquiring it, when the mind is still running the acquisition math and the eyes are looking for confirmation rather than information. He covered the machine with a tarp, went inside, had supper with his wife, and watched the evening news. The next morning he went to the shop at 7 o'clock with a fresh notebook and began. The cab flood damage was the first thing he documented, systematically, panel by panel. The headliner had deteriorated, the seat was destroyed, the instrument cluster had visible corrosion on the connector pins. The wiring harness through the cab showed rodent damage at 3 locations, chewed insulation, compromised conductors, one section where the damage was severe enough that replacement rather than repair was the correct approach. He pulled the section and measured it and wrote down the part number. The engine seizure was the critical question, and he approached it the way he approached every critical question, with the assumption that the answer was not yet known, and that the path to knowing it required removing enough material to see clearly. He pulled the valve cover first. What he found was not what flood damage typically produces. The engine had not hydrolocked from water intrusion, a failure mode that usually means a destroyed engine, bent rods, cracked block. What he found was an engine that had seized from oil starvation. The oil was present but badly degraded, the kind of degradation that happens when a machine sits for an extended period after a final run with contaminated oil, and the oil film on critical bearing surfaces breaks down over time until the surfaces contact each other and seize. The damage was to the main bearings. The crankshaft had spun a bearing on the number 3 journal. The bore was intact. The heads were intact. The block was intact. Walter sat on his shop stool and looked at the engine for a while. A spun bearing on a seized engine sounds like a totaled engine to most people who hear those words. To a man who has rebuilt agricultural diesel engines across 40 years in service bays, it is a different conversation. The crankshaft would need to go out for grinding. The journal surface was damaged and had to be brought back to a precise dimension before an undersized bearing set could be installed. That was machine work he would send out. The rest of the rebuild was in his hands. He had the tools, the service data, the parts knowledge, and the patience. He did not have urgency, which was the most valuable thing a man rebuilding a seized engine can possess. He called a machine shop in Liberal he had used for dealership work over the years. The shop quoted $340 for the crankshaft grinding. Walter sourced the undersized bearing set himself from a supplier in Wichita. $220 for the full set, correct specification for the ground journals. He pulled the engine down over the weekend, extracted the crankshaft Monday, had it back from the machine shop Wednesday. He assembled the bottom end with the attention to clearance and torque specification that 40 years of this work had made automatic. He started the engine on a Thursday morning. It ran rough for 40 seconds while oil pressure built and the new bearings seated. Then it smoothed. He ran it for an hour at varying RPM, listening for bearing distress. He heard nothing that concerned him. The engine had cost him $560 in parts and machine work and 11 days of his own labor. The electrical repair took 4 more days. The cab wiring harness section that had been destroyed by rodents was a sourced replacement, $340 from a supplier who stocked MF5711 components. The instrument cluster connector pins cleaned with electrical contact cleaner and showed continuity after cleaning. The cab panels and headliner he sourced from a parts machine he located through an online agricultural equipment listing. A 5711 with a destroyed drivetrain and an intact cab, located in Oklahoma, whose owner sold him the interior components for $180 including the seat. Walter drove to Oklahoma on a Saturday and was back by Sunday afternoon. The hydraulic system, which he had not been able to test before the auction, turned out to be the best news of the entire project. No damage. The pump tested within specification. The cylinders extended and retracted correctly. The system had been better protected from the conditions that had damaged everything else by the geometry of the machine and by what appeared to be a functioning cab seal that had failed from the top but held from below. Total parts expenditure to bring the Massey Ferguson 5711 to full operational condition, $1,760. The auction price, $400. Total investment, $2,160, plus Walter's labor, which he was not counting as a cost because the alternative to spending that time in his shop was spending it not in his shop, which was not an alternative he found appealing. He drove the machine out of the shop on a Tuesday morning in early May. The MF5711 ran cleanly. The hydraulics responded correctly. The cab was dry, the instruments functional, the seat new. Walter ran it across his lot and back and shut it down and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he called a farmer he had known for 20 years, a man named Don Perkins, who ran a wheat operation 12 miles south, and who had mentioned at a co-op meeting the previous fall that he was in the market for a utility tractor. Don came over that afternoon. He walked around the machine. He asked what had been wrong with it. Walter told him, in the same complete and direct way he had documented everything, what the auction condition had been, what he had found, and what he had done. Don asked what Walter wanted for it. Walter said $22,500. Don said that was fair. He asked if he could bring it back if anything surfaced in the first 30 days. Walter said yes. Don wrote the check. The machine never came back. What came back, starting 2 weeks after Don drove the 5711 home, was Don's neighbor, who had heard the story and had an MF6S with a hydraulic issue he couldn't get the regional dealer to schedule. Then Don's neighbor's brother-in-law with a different machine and a different problem. Then a farmer from 2 counties over who had driven past the dealer in Liberal without stopping and followed directions to Walter's shop from a man at the grain elevator who had heard from Don's neighbor that there was a retired Deere technician outside Liberal who could work on Massey Ferguson equipment at rates that made sense. Walter had not planned to work on other people's equipment. He had planned to find machines at auction, restore them, and sell them. The first machine had sold cleanly and profitably. The second machine he bought, a flood-damaged MF6S, he located at an estate sale in Comanche County for $600, was sitting in his shop awaiting inspection when the neighbor's call came in. Walter did both. He worked on the neighbor's machine and he assessed the success. He found, in that combination, something he had not expected to find in retirement. The same satisfaction he had gotten from the best years of dealership work, without the scheduling pressure, the upsell requirements, the corporate efficiency metrics, and the documentation overhead that the dealership had built around every hour of shop time in the last decade before the consolidation. The work was the same. The conditions were different. The conditions were better. By the end of the first full year operating from his shop, Walter had restored and sold 4 machines and had taken in repair work from 19 farms across 3 counties. He had not advertised. He had a handwritten sign at the end of his driveway that said farm equipment repair and a phone number. Every customer who called had been sent by someone else who had called before them. Walter kept a notebook of every job, machine, problem, diagnosis, parts, labor hours, charge. He kept the notebook the same way he had kept service records at the dealership, with the same level of completeness. Because a man who has spent 40 years creating the documentation that protects both the shop and the customer does not abandon the practice when the shop is his own. The notebook at the end of the first year showed $78,000 in revenue across repair work and machine sales combined. Walter had expected less. He was not disappointed by more. He was thoughtful about it in the way he was thoughtful about engine clearances, precisely without excitement, focused on what the number meant rather than how it felt. What it meant was that the demand was real and the service gap was real, and his position at the intersection of 40 years of mechanical knowledge and a regional dealer network that could not serve the smaller and older end of the market at prices those customers could sustain was not an accident. It was a structural condition. It had existed before Walter arrived at his shop. It would exist after. He had not created the gap. He was filling it, the way a man fills any gap that his specific capabilities are suited to fill, without drama and without a business plan, one machine at a time. The second year came in at $112,000. Walter hired his first help, a part-time arrangement with a young man named Curtis Hale, who had grown up on a farm in Kiowa County and had 2 years of vocational agricultural mechanics behind him. Curtis worked 3 days a week. Walter paid him fairly and taught him the way he had been taught at the beginning of his own career, by doing the work beside him, explaining what he was looking at and why, letting Curtis make the diagnosis and then checking it. By the end of the second year, Curtis was working 5 days a week and handling straightforward repairs independently, while Walter handled the diagnostic work that required depth of experience. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer in Liberal had heard about Walter's shop by the end of the first year, through the same channels that all such information travels in agricultural communities. A customer mention, a service inquiry that referenced Walter's name, a pattern in the dealer's work orders suggesting that a category of customers had stopped appearing. The dealer's service manager drove past Walter's property without stopping, which Walter's wife observed from the kitchen window and reported to Walter without editorial comment. Walter said he expected that. His wife said she supposed so. The dealer principal called in the spring of the second year. He asked Walter if he was interested in a conversation about an authorized service relationship. Walter said he was willing to have the conversation. The dealer principal described the authorization requirements, training certification, tooling requirements, parts procurement through authorized channels, labor rate minimums that the manufacturer required for warranty reimbursement. Walter listened to all of it and asked 2 questions. The first was whether the authorized labor rate minimum was above or below his current rate. The dealer principal said it was above his current rate. Walter said that meant he would have to charge his customers more to comply with the authorization. The dealer principal said the authorization would bring warranty work that offset the rate increase. Walter asked what percentage of his current work involved machines under warranty. There was a pause. The dealer principal said he understood the situation. Walter said he appreciated the call. He did not pursue the authorization. What the conversation confirmed, in a way that Walter had suspected but not fully articulated, was that the authorization structure served manufacturers and dealers in ways that were not identical to the ways it served farmers, particularly the farmers who were his customers, who ran older machines, who were past warranty, who needed competent work at rates that reflected the economics of operations that were not large. The authorization would have changed what he was. He had spent 40 years being what the dealership needed him to be. He was not interested in spending the next portion of his working life being what the manufacturer's authorization required. He went back to the shop and got on with it. By the end of the third year, Walter's shop had generated $142,000 in annual revenue. He had Curtis full-time and had added a part-time arrangement with a retired farmer named Arlen Beck. No mechanical certification, but 40 years of practical knowledge about how agricultural equipment fails in field conditions. That is a different kind of knowledge from service manual knowledge, and equally important to a shop that is diagnosing problems rather than simply executing prescribed repairs. Arlen worked 2 days a week and was worth considerably more than 2 days of his time suggested. The Massey Ferguson 5711 that Walter had bought for $400 was not in his shop anymore. It was working ground 12 miles south on Don Perkins' operation, accumulating hours the way properly maintained machines accumulate hours, steadily, without drama, in the service of a man who knew what he had paid for it and trusted that the work behind it was sound. Walter occasionally saw it when he drove past the Perkins place on his way to a service call in the southern part of the county. He did not stop. There was no reason to stop. The machine was running. His work was done. What had not been done and would not be done for as long as Walter chose to keep working was the larger project of filling a service gap that had existed before him and would require his continued presence to remain filled. The farmers who called him were not calling a business. They were calling a man, a specific man with a specific history and 40 years of knowledge that could not be replicated by a sign at the end of a driveway. The reputation was personal, built on the credibility of a man who told you what was wrong with your machine and what it would cost and whether it was worth fixing, and who had been right enough times that the question of whether he was right this time did not need asking. By the time the third year closed, and Walter sat with the notebook and the spreadsheet his daughter had built him and the full picture of what the operation had become, the cumulative 3-year revenue stood at $332,000. He did not celebrate the number. He noted it. He filed the notebook in the cabinet above the workbench beside the 2 notebooks that had preceded it. He wrote the year and the total on the spine in black marker, the same way he had labeled service records at the dealership for 40 years. Then he went to an estate auction in Comanche County, where a Massey Ferguson 7S with a destroyed transmission and a sound engine was listed without reserve, and he sat in the back of the crowd while the auctioneer worked through the morning's equipment and waited for the number to get low enough that the math worked in his direction. It did. It always did. For a man who knew what a machine was worth when other people were deciding it was worth nothing. The dealership consolidation that had handed Walter a severance check and cleaned out his toolbox had made a calculation about what 40 years of mechanical knowledge cost to carry on a balance sheet. The calculation had concluded that the cost was too high and that the knowledge could be replaced by the efficiencies that consolidation was supposed to produce. The farms that drove past the consolidated dealership on their way to Walter's shop were the answer to that calculation. They were not a verdict on the dealership. They were a market condition, the natural consequence of a service gap that appeared when the structure built to fill it was reorganized around priorities other than filling it. Walter had not sought the gap. He had simply been the person available to fill it, with the tools and the knowledge and the time and the lack of any particular reason not to. He had paid $400 for the machine that started it. The machine was running 12 miles south, doing the work it was built to do, on a farm whose operator had paid a fair price for it and received a sound machine in return. The man who had restored it was in his shop on a Tuesday morning, with two mechanics working beside him and a line of equipment outside that represented 30 farms across 3 counties that had decided his address was the right answer to the question of where to take a machine that needed attention. The auctioneer had called it sold for $400. Walter had decided it was worth considerably more than that. 3 years later, the numbers agreed with him completely.